So, as with all sci fi Pol Sci, there's going to be a lot of extrapolation, a lot of speculation, a lot of me trying to compare this to real world events. And that kind of takes precedence over strict canon. I'm trying to be educational and entertaining here rather than sticking with exactly what the source material says. Also, this is going to be based upon the books and the movies. I've seen all the movies multiple times and I've read the books several times. I know there's like Pottermore and there's all this other stuff J.K. Rowling said in interviews. And there's all this stuff on the Potter Wiki. I might reference that, but for the purposes of this, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the books and movies. Because this just, like, I'm familiar with it and that I've read it all and watched all the movies several times. But I'm not as familiar as something like Dune or A Song of Ice and Fire. That being said, let's get into it. So, the real life parallels within the context of the First and Second Wizarding Wars are kind of interesting. What's kind of strange is Grindelwald being the first Dark Lord and then being succeeded by Voldemort kind of makes it feel like his regime or his attempt was World War One, and then obviously the Second Wizarding War is supposed to be kind of like World War Two, but you got to kind of wonder where the First Wizarding War is within this. Voldemort is obviously a analog for Hitler, but it is kind of weird that he would die and then come back 10 years later, but you also have this other world war that happened way before then. But for the purpose of this analysis, I'm going to say loosely the First Wizarding War is kind of like World War One, and the Second Wizarding War is kind of like World War Two, for ideological, political, and historical reasons, which we'll get into in a moment. So before we get into the actual war and its aftermath, let's talk a bit about what the background of it was. And once again, I know all this other stuff has come out afterwards, much of it proving what my speculation was, but we're just going to look at it from how I got the impression I got reading the books. So the Wizarding World largely to me seems like it's in the Victorian era, or maybe a little bit before, in terms of the technology level and the social structure. Now, we don't know exactly how the political system works. We see the Wizengamot, which I'm probably mispronouncing. Wizengamot? Whatever. I'll just call it the Wizard Parliament, which doesn't seem to be particularly large. And I can't recall us ever really hearing about elections being held. The Minister of Magic seems to be elected by the Wizarding Parliament, but we don't really know how the members are chosen. In the fandom, the kind of consensus seems to be that the seats in it are hereditary and that they've declined over time, and that pureblood families hold a certain seat or a certain number of votes within it, and that these seats are inheritable. So you may get into a situation where you have half-bloods or quarter-bloods even inherit these seats, and it comes down through, I would assume it's a paternal inheritance. A lot of people seem to think you have a case where because a lot of families go extinct over time, you'll have situations where someone might hold multiple votes. Now, we didn't see them there, but a lot of people tend to think that the Weasleys, because they're a pureblood family, probably have at least one vote. But we're not really sure, once again, how it's selected, if it's drawn by lot from without these various families, if all these families are allowed to participate, if most of them have a proxy that does the daily business of government, or even if there's some sort of property requirement. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to imagine it works a bit like the British political system did prior to when they started passing the Reform Acts, where it's basically an oligarchy, where the majority of there's technically kind of elections. There's a very small portion of the population that can actually vote, and it functions more like an oligarchy than any type of democracy as we would recognize it today. Probably something like the Roman Republic, or like I said, like how a lot of early modern representative systems worked. Parliament, like I said, doesn't seem to be very large, so I would imagine that most wizarding families, even the pureblood, half-blood, and three-quarter ones, don't have any sort of representation. And as there doesn't really seem to be any sort of elections, they have virtually no voice in government, which once again kind of reminds me of how 19th century Britain functioned. More on that in a minute. The impression I got is that there's a large middle and working class and poor, like poor purebloods or poor three-quarter bloods, or just kind of poor, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, ethnic wizards who have no say in government. And I would not be surprised if a lot of them live in poverty or on the dole or something like that. Most of wizarding society seems to be employed by the Ministry of Magic, and I kind of get the impression that because magic has kind of fulfilled most of the menial tasks that a traditional working class would normally fulfill, a lot of the lower classes really don't have much to do. To kind of quote Augustus in Rome, or rather to paraphrase, the nobility have all the land and the magic itself has all the jobs. So I would imagine the upper class of society live leisured lives, kind of like 19th century gentlemen, and the lower classes kind of have to scrape by doing odd jobs, or I would imagine there's probably some sort of welfare system. We could even have a case where the majority of the tax burden falls upon the lower classes. Once again, we don't really know. So you have a situation in which there's an oligarchy and the vast majority of the population is disenfranchised and can't vote. Now, there's this idea that the upper class in society is always conservative, and that's not the case, particularly in Great Britain, where a large portion of the upper class was liberal, and a lot of the working class, at least under Disraeli and some of the conservative presidents, prime ministers, was very conservative. If anything, liberalism is kind of an upper middle class or lower upper class ideology. It's not so much something that really appeals to the working class or a lot of, I guess you could say, the lower end of the middle class. It's just not something that really appeals to them. And you kind of get this case a lot in rural areas, like in Canada, where the population will vote for the Socialist Party or the Conservative Party, but the Liberal Party really doesn't have much in the way of, they don't really have anything to offer rural people or the working class in general. Generally speaking, the people who vote for them are wealthy people or upper middle class people who are cosmopolitan from cities, but not really what would be considered the dregs of society. And a lot of times the revolutions that come about, and I've talked about this a lot in Making Modernity, were the product of the upper middle class who tended to favor political liberalism, because when the regime kind of collapsed or changed, they'd be in the best position to kind of inherit the new order. Also, there's a certain complacency that often comes about within nobility, where they start to kind of take noblesse oblige in a very kind of progressive way. So you have this, and the other thing I think that you have to keep in mind, as you can see, is particularly in Harry Potter, there's been an immense amount of mass immigration over the last couple of decades. And this is into a society which, if my kind of reading of it is correct, there's already widespread unemployment and a widespread lower class that has horrible job prospects. And into that, you're throwing a lot of immigrants, many of whom are probably, if it's anything like real life, very poor or not as skilled. And that's making the situation even worse. And a lot of the immigrants probably get more welfare than the lower classes. So I think there's a lot of resentment there. That there's probably a lot of resentment among the average wizard towards the parliament and towards kind of both factions, kind of the classical liberal faction and kind of the reactionary faction, because neither of them is really fulfilling their needs. So this is kind of the situation, as I'm trying to set up, in which fascism came into place. As I've said, if you listen to a lot of fascist songs or propaganda, they'll talk about crushing the reactionaries and the liberals. They'll call themselves like a populist or progressive ideology, but one that is very anti-liberal. It is very kind of collectivist. It's an opposition to both kind of a lot of aspects of kind of hierarchical reactionary thought and to kind of progressive modernist liberal thought. So my view is when Voldemort came onto the scene, he kind of embodied both because while he came from a noble background, he also grew up in poverty. And I think he was able to, kind of how Hitler did and a lot of the various fascist leaders did, kind of unite the interests of the aristocracy and kind of the upper conservative class with the populist demands of the lower class and kind of somehow balance these kind of things. In general, how fascism kind of achieved this was through class collaboration. I think that's kind of what Voldemort did, is by kind of portraying Muggles and half-bloods and non-humans as kind of the other. He was able to get rid of a lot of the class hatred and class distinctions within wizarding society in appealing broadly to both groups. And you can kind of see this in the movies because there's a lot of what appear to be poor working class wizards who are not formally Death Eaters but are kind of the militia or the foot soldiers of Voldemort's army. The kind of people who support Dumbledore tend to be middle or upper middle class. We don't really seem to have political representation to the same amount, but also want to upheave the existing order. So that's kind of what I view happened in the First Wizarding World War. Is Voldemort was able to take kind of the radical conservatives and the disaffected wizarding population and form them together in a coalition into kind of the against the old guard. And I think what kind of united the wizarding parliament and the upper class, be they moderate conservatives, moderate liberals, kind of the center, was a desire to maintain the existing system, to maintain their monopoly on political power, to maintain kind of what I kind of consider classical liberal ideas, and just reject kind of the reforms of both sides that were pushing for a more open political process, either under the auspices of a totalitarian populist state or under a more open liberal democratic state. And I think these sides were fairly well balanced. Voldemort had a lot of foot soldiers and a lot of political support. I think it says somewhere that the Order of the Phoenix was outnumbered 20-1, but the institutions opted to side with the more progressive wing because they felt that they'd have a better hope of compromising with them and kind of throwing some token reforms out there. Also, the progressive wing was less committed to violent revolution. So I think kind of a combination of the two more or less put them into a balance within the context of the First Wizarding War. And I found this even when I was younger, that Dumbledore's probably the head of the progressive faction. And I think that has been confirmed with some new stuff as he wanted more Muggle rights. I assume he probably wanted to extend the franchise. I would imagine he's supportive of mass immigration and of probably extending the franchise to non or semi-humans. Probably all the other social liberal dreams, more sexual openness, decline of the traditional family, all that sort of thing. So in the First Wizarding War, it seems like, as I said, both sides were kind of exhausted by the end. I think Voldemort had the upper hand. I think in what they've released afterwards, the Ministry had the upper hand, but both sides were kind of exhausted. And what wound up happening is the Death Eaters kind of lost the war, but none of the underlying social, political, or military issues were effectively resolved. While a lot of the Death Eaters were imprisoned after the war, a lot of them weren't. And with kind of both the far right and far left kind of exhausted and devastated, kind of the centrist status quo faction that would eventually elect Fudge as their head was able to maintain its power. And so you had a decade or two of basically nothing happening, with the underlying tensions in society not being resolved. It's kind of what some people said about Versailles: we've only won a truce for 20 years. Where theoretically Versailles seems like it would be more definitive, as Germany lost a lot of territory, it had to pay reparations, it had its military severely curtailed, etc. But as kind of Hitler would prove, Germany was not down for the count and was just kind of biding its time and would be ready for a rematch later on. Germany was not permanently defeated. in that sense. The issue is, I think Germany's defeat in World War One was more decisive than Voldemort's defeat in the First Wizarding War. I've been trying really hard to think of an example similar to this. The best one I could come up with is if at the height of the Spanish Civil War, Franco died and maybe the head of the Republican government died. And then the two sides just kind of signed a white peace and they went back to a very shaky, corrupt, and divisive republic. And neither the far right nor far left had really been able to achieve much in the war other than kind of weaken the centrist faction, and things would just kind of limp along for a couple decades until it would eventually erupt into hostility again. But once again, like as I said, nothing was really resolved in the First Wizarding War. I don't think the lower class or the middle class's position got any better. Dumbledore wasn't able to deliver any of his reforms, and the purebloods became more and more afraid that their way of life was being destroyed. And once again, I also think that the lower classes were like that, because keep in mind, a lot of the lower classes historically have been fairly socially conservative and don't like the threat to their way of life that a lot of modernity poses. One of kind of the great achievements of the Conservative Party under Benjamin Disraeli was to make the Conservatives more of a mass movement. The British Empire and British nationalism was kind of promoted as a way of bringing the working class on board. And you had a lot of fights between Labour and the Conservatives, and eventually you had the classical Liberal Party. Like the Liberal Party basically fell apart and is now a very reformed third place. But to the vast bulk of the population, either kind of conservative, imperialist, or nationalist ideas appeal, or socialist kind of labor ideals appeal. And once again, Voldemort is kind of the guy in between that, and the liberals are kind of out of place in that a lot of their power depends upon the very limited franchise and electoral system. It's quite possible if there had been an open election and Voldemort had run for office, he likely would have won. We don't really know how much society supported either candidate. Certainly part of Voldemort's issue is he was unnecessarily brutal and cruel, and if he had pursued a more kind of peaceable, morally upright campaign, he very likely could have won peacefully or diplomatically or otherwise accomplish his objectives. But his personal insanity, and this is partially just because of how J.K. Rowling didn't want to write sympathetic villains or villains whose causes really made any sense, he basically just kind of alienated everybody. Even then, though, he had a lot of supporters, and the so-called forces of the light had to rely on a Deus Ex Machina twice to beat him. So the Interwar Period, I think, is very much a good metaphor for what happened historically, where, as I said, the First World War didn't really resolve the underlying issues of the age, and you had fascism, communism, and more radical forms of liberalism emerge to kind of take different opinions on the questions of modernity, and kind of the general loss in faith, the loss of civilizational confidence that followed the First World War. And into that, from my understanding, you had a stream of kind of moderate conservative ministers of magic. A lot of people view Fudge really negatively, but I think he was in a very bad position because I think he was a compromise candidate between the left, right, and status quo, in that he was conservative but not excessively pro-pureblood, nor excessively anti-non-human, but was also uninterested in stripping the aristocracy of its traditional privileges and opening up the electoral and political system to a larger portion of society. So he was kind of the compromise candidate that pleased absolutely no one, but he was able to hang on. I think it was like 6 years or something. He was able to continue on as Minister of Magic because there was literally no one else that could be agreed upon to run things. And eventually, as with Neville Chamberlain and a lot of moderate governments, once the war finally broke out in the end, the moderate faction was swept aside, and kind of extremists on both sides took center stage. Now, what appears to have happened in the aftermath of the Second Wizarding War, and this is just kind of my speculation, is it was a somewhat more decisive victory, and the Death Eaters and all their supporters underwent a very powerful purge. My other thinking is what they might have done is maybe it was something like what they did in the South following the Civil War, where they stripped all the white Southerners of their voting rights and only allowed the blacks to vote. So you had a situation in which the Republicans, despite being hated by everybody in the South, would win every national election. So that could have been a thing where they stripped the voting rights, or they passed like electoral reform, but they selectively removed voting rights from people who had been friendly with Voldemort, and like kept them with all the minorities and stuff like that, so that it finally kind of broke the deadlock and it gave the left an absolute majority. And I would imagine after they gained their majority, they started kind of electioneering and rigging it to try to ensure that the actual British wizarding population would quickly become a permanent minority, through increasing mass immigration, granting non-humans voting rights, and otherwise just kind of opening up society. Whereas with traditional liberal revolutions, the upper middle class would use kind of the grievances of these various kind of minorities and subpopulations as a way to maintain power and to effectively get them to vote against their national interest. So that's kind of my view of the First and Second Wizarding War, me trying to kind of compare it to real world politics and historically what was happening through the time period Rowling appears to have been trying to channel. So I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope it was interesting. And more sci-fi Pol Sci to come soon. This is Arjun, and I'll talk to you guys all later.